Hello, this is my final biology project. My name is Elise Acuff, and I'm taking a close look into the benefits and consequences of the protist algae, with a little focus here and there on other marine protists, specifically in the aquatic environment, both in nature and in aquascaping and aquariums. So what is a protist? So number one, I just want to emphasize that a protist is not a plant. A lot of people will mistake algae specifically for a plant because it is photosynthetic and has chlorophyll A and B, which gives it its green color. However, algae is a protist, and a protist is any eukaryotic organism, so it has a nucleus that is not a plant, animal, or fungus. So algae does not have a vascular system. It doesn't have roots. It doesn't have the sporophyte, gametophyte stage. It doesn't have any of those reproductive stages or any of what you would associate with a plant. Simply, it has the photosynthetic qualities. And there are many types of organisms, microorganisms, that fall under a protist, and most of them, if not all of them, will be microorganisms. Most protists are unicellular or multicellular. Most in general are unicellular. Up here you have water molds and euglenids. Both of those are unicellular. So the whole organism itself or the whole cell of it is that organism, which is pretty wild to think about. There are many types of protists. So yeah, like I said, we have the euglenids, we have water molds, but there are many types within the supergroups. You have your archaeplastids, which includes algae, red algae, green algae, all the different types of algae, and anything you would think that looks like a plant, really. Then you have the SAR group, excavates, your little amoebas, and other things that fall under this that most people have not heard of. And these, some of them cause disease. The ones I'm going to talk about, in general, algae does not, but it does have its own environmental consequences. So how do protists reproduce? So most use asexual mitosis. There are some that use sexual in unfavorable conditions, but the reason I am emphasizing asexual mitosis is that algae reproduces quite rapidly. It is photosynthetic, so it makes energy from the sun, but because it is asexual, it doesn't have to find a partner to necessarily reproduce. It can do so at a much faster rate because it doesn't have to do that. Right here we have diatoms, and they are also grow at a very fast rate, especially when there is light. You can see under the microscope there are many shapes and sizes. And this just shows you in this picture that this is how fast algae can repopulate. So what is algae? Algae is a microscopic organism with pigment chlorophyll, which it uses to turn sunlight into food. And where does it live? It can live anywhere with moisture and sunlight. So there are two specific zones that we actually talked about in biology class, the littoral and limnetic zone. Both of those are going to be closer to the surface of the water. So you're not going to really see as much algae in deeper water because algae is photosynthetic, so it needs sunlight. And if you're in darker, deeper water, there's not going to be any sunlight, so you're not going to find as much phytoplankton or algae. There can be, but the deeper you go, usually the less there is, or you're going to see other types of marine protists at that point. This is algae under a microscope. It has the cellular wall just like a plant, and that is why it's mistaken as a plant. But remember, there's no roots, no vascular system, none of that stuff. You can even find algae in just soil if it's very moist and it's in the sun. And they're also in aquariums. Even if you don't have any live plants, you can still have algae grow there because they are actually airborne, so they can come via fish bag water, so introduce new plants, but also even if there's no new plants, no new anything that has an algae spore or anything like that, they can be introduced, which is pretty crazy to think about. So algae is easy to travel. It can go just about anywhere. All it needs is a little sunlight and moisture. So kind of like a lot of fungus and other things. So this is just a picture. This is also from our textbook, and I do have photo credits to each source. But we have our limnetic zone and then our littoral zone, and you'll see here that these are more the shallow waters because there's sunlight, and the deeper you get, you're going to see more detritivores, but you're going to see less algae. So what is the positive environmental impact of algae? Well, algae is needed, believe it or not. Most people hate algae just because they think it's plain ugly, inconvenient, especially if you have your own aquarium. But it does have its own benefits, and as every living organism does, it has its place in the environment. So phytoplankton is a staple diet. Most people don't realize that phytoplankton is the same thing as algae. It is a microscopic organism, and algae is phytoplankton. And a lot of aquatic organisms will eat that, like small fish, snails, zooplankton, tadpoles, crustaceans, water-dwelling insects. All of these organisms depend on algae because they are primary consumers, and they might eat plants, but they might also eat algae. And some of them don't eat plants. Some of them just eat algae. And if you don't have algae, there's no food for these primary consumers. They die, and this creates a mass death of the food chain. Another thing to think about is because algae is photosynthetic, just like plants, it produces oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis. And we need oxygen in our waters. So just like a plant, it can give you that oxygen that animals need to survive in the water. So moderate amounts, notice I underlined that, can benefit the environment because organisms need oxygen to survive. So these are just some of our detritivores. That's an amano shrimp. We have a pleco. We have our blue tang, our clownfish, sea urchin. That's a yellow blenny. And that's my snail, limoncello. She's awesome. So what are the negative environmental impacts of algae? So plants and algae both require nitrogen and phosphorus to photosynthesize and grow. That is a fact. Plants and algae grow by utilizing these natural resources in the environment. But unfortunately, humans have added a lot more nitrogen and phosphorus to the ecosystem via fertilizer runoff, and that is just one way. And this causes eutrophication, where you have excess nutrients in the environment, and that can create dead zones or areas where there is no oxygen. And you just have a bunch of algae in the water, and that will cause problems. But right here we have the phosphorus cycle, and there are natural ways that phosphorus gets into the ocean and helps algae grow, but we have just added on to that with the fertilizer input of it. We already have phosphorus in, the reservoir of just mining, and erosion causes that to slide off with the storms into rivers and ponds and oceans. But with fertilizers in our environment, and when we grow and use pesticides and things, those come straight into here, and they impact our oceans and our water. So why is eutrophication a problem? Excess nutrients in the water lead to overgrowth of algae, exponential growth. Algae doesn't reach a carrying capacity. Everything has a carrying capacity. But if you keep adding nutrients continuously into those waters, such as fertilizer, algae never reaches that carrying capacity because it never runs out of food. So it's going to keep growing, and it's going to experience exponential growth like this instead of what we would want, which is logistic growth. Algae has a type 3 survivorship curve, so it's just going to have more and more and more. It's never ending. It creates a lot. So why is eutrophication a problem? We're still talking about it. Algae decomposes, and detritivores use up dissolved oxygen. So when they're using up this dissolved oxygen, you have to remember that it's funny because algae gives oxygen. But even though it gives oxygen, when it decomposes, because just like every living thing, it has to die at some point, organisms that are going to eat it, such as detritivores, which eat up decaying matter, are going to use up that dissolved oxygen. So the more algae there is, the more oxygen it's going to pull from that environment. No oxygen, everything's going to die. This results in massive fish kills. So you see these big fish kills. And these don't happen all the time, but they're more likely in smaller bodies of waters like bays. But when you do this, it's going to reduce the biodiversity. It's going to hurt commercial fishing. Let's say people are trying to fish and we need fish to eat, and this happens. It's going to mess things up. And another thing is we have cyanobacteria, which is called blue-green algae. But this is in fact not a protist or really an algae. It's actually a bacteria that looks a lot like algae and is mistaken for it. And it can be just as harmful and even release toxic chemicals that harm wildlife, including us. And besides the use up of dissolved oxygen, eutrophication is a problem because algae blocks light to deeper waters. So if you have all of this algae on the surface of the water, our producers, like plants at the bottom, they're not going to get any sunlight, and they're not going to live because they can't create energy. And if they can't create energy, they're not going to survive. So they don't produce oxygen. So not only are we using up dissolved oxygen, we're losing our sources of oxygen, and that results in more death. And the detrivores are going to come back and eat more and use up even more oxygen. So the biggest problem is our lack of dissolved oxygen, which is from light that's not given to deeper waters, to plants in deeper waters, and just the fact that detritivores eat it all up. And this creates dead zones, which is where there is no oxygen, period. This is a big example of this is Chesapeake Bay. This is a bay that has been monitored for years because there's a huge dead zone that just runs miles and miles of almost a good portion of the bay. This is actually from 2009. They have a newer photo, but it talks about the goals, and it's not very specific on what the goals are. You can find this in my sources, and we'll talk about that. But when you have these dead zones, there's going to be fish that wash up, and eventually there's really not going to be any fish at all. Or they're going to migrate to places where there's not a dead zone, so they're going to go somewhere in the blue over here. Besides fertilizers, there's also sewage in automobiles, which release CO2, and then manure, because there's a lot of phosphorus and nitrogen in manure, in any waste product that's going to go into bodies of water. So what can we do? So let's just start with understand what's happening. We should be aware of what is in our fertilizers and what we're doing. So be aware of the chemicals that are in your fertilizers. What is the percent of phosphorus and total nitrogen? Here's an analysis. This is pretty high. This is 18% here, and that's supposed to be here. This is 24% here. That's a lot. So maybe we should look at more natural ways. We should know the proper dosage, when to feed and how much to give our plants. Sometimes our plants don't even need it. Sometimes we're in a rush to make them grow. They don't need to be rushed. And sometimes they just need time. But we need to also be smart about when we fertilize. Don't fertilize right before a rainstorm. It's going to go straight into the ocean. Terrible idea. Use alternatives, eggshells, coffee grounds, fruit peels, tree leaves. Make your own compost. And do so in moderation, and make infrastructure or barriers that are going to keep it from going into a body of water. Be aware of your surroundings. Do you have a body of water really close to you? What is the incline like? Are you on a hill? These are things to think about that we don't really go into detail, but are still important. So aquarium keeping and algae, same rules apply. This is for aquarium keeping. Algae produces oxygen, that's great. Primary consumers eat it, but there's a difference. Aquariums are microbiospheres that mimic ecosystems in the wild, but because the surface area of a tank is so much smaller than a true ecosystem, because essentially you have a mini ecosystem, everything is affected at a more immediate level. So now we can look at pH. And I wanted to include this picture just to show you that carrying capacity in an aquarium is going to be a lot smaller. You can't have as many organisms in an aquarium. When an area gets full, a fish can't just swim away. It's stuck there. It's stuck in the aquarium. When you have a bacterial infestation, it's going to be stuck. It can't go anywhere. I mean, it can spread, but your fish can't leave that environment, and it's going to spread much more rapidly because there's so less surface area to cover. And this is a huge problem with beginners in aquarium keeping. They don't understand that if you actually get a bigger aquarium, you're going to do a lot better because things are not affected chemically so fast, and you have more time to compose yourself if something goes wrong. So how does algae affect pH? So what is pH? It's the measurement of hydrogen ions. The more ions you have, the more acidic it is. Aquatic organisms need the pH of their water to be in a specific range to survive, just like most people. There's an ideal temperature, or not temperature, but pH, and there's an actual pH. For example, my betta fish are supposed to be at an ideal pH of 7. What are they actually at? 8.4 probably? A little high, but as long as it's not changing rapidly all the time, they can deal with it. But pH with algae in ponds largely fluctuates. So why does it fluctuate? In the morning, CO2 levels are high as a result of respiration, which occurred in the pond overnight. But as the day progresses and sun shines, plants begin photosynthesis, consuming more of that CO2 and lowering pH. So when CO2 is low, pH rises. So your pH, if you have algae in your tank, aquarium, pool, whatever you want to call it, your pH is going to change all the time if you don't keep a steady control of the nutrients in your tank and the algae. And this can stress your fish out, and when your fish get stressed, this makes them more susceptible to bacterial diseases, fungal infections, all sorts of things. So we want to make sure our pH isn't changing all the time, and that's why it's so important to make sure you're taking care of the algae in your tank. Now, what are some other protists? I promise you I'm almost done. This is ick. I'm not even going to say this because that's too complicated to say. Ick is a unicellular protozoan in superclass chromoalveolate. So it has those sac-like membranes. This type of protist is parasitic. Algae is not. But as you can see, even though algae is not parasitic, it can be pretty dangerous. But is still essential to our environment because a lot of organisms eat it. There's not many things that are going to eat ick, unfortunately. It's actually the thing that monitors our own fish populations, and it lives in water as expected. Whoops. Now, the reproduction of ick is a lot more complicated. It is transmitted to ponds and aquariums by carrier fish or water pumps from our streams. Once one fish has it, it spreads. It spreads very fast. And when it leaves this infected fish, it's called a tomont. Tomont's attached to the pond bottom, so they're going to go to the bottom of the lake or the pond, and they're going to form a thin-walled cyst on this object or this thing, and sometimes even a fish. And in this cyst, the tomont divides into many tomites, so little mini ones, and these are released from the cyst, and they've rapidly reproduced in this little cyst-like thing, and then they are released as theronts or swarmers, and these little swarmers are going to go out in a pond or a lake. Think of them like little viruses, and they're just going to find anything they can get a hold on, and once they penetrate the epithelium, which is that thin layer, the first layer of the host, they can become trophonts. And that's when you have a problem, because now you can actually see what's going on, and at this point it becomes harder to treat. So here's a little image that kind of describes this better than I just did. But you have your trophonts feeding on fish skin. This is our carrier. It leaves the fish and develops into a tomont, and this is that little cyst-like structure. This tomont produces several thousand theronts, and in this theronts they release the tomites, and the tomites attach to the fish, and then it just repeats itself. It's a vicious cycle, and it wipes out fish populations. But we do need to monitor our fish population, so this can be good. But if you're keeping a small body of water like an aquarium, this might wipe your entire tank, and that is when it's not so good. It attacks the gills of our fish. The gills swell as our white blood cells attack the infection, And when this happens, it reduces oxygen flow from water to blood in the gills, because if you can't get oxygen in the gills because they're so inflamed, your fish isn't gonna get any oxygen. It's gonna die. It also destroys the fins, from what we understand. I would assume it could also even cause fin rot. The sicker your fish is, the more susceptible it is to other bacterial infections. And you have bacteria in your tank all the time. Fish are just immune to those because they grow immunity. But when they get sick with one thing, they're more likely to get sick with others. So, an important thing about treatment: treat as soon as possible. Once the rods penetrate the skin, treatment's more difficult. It's important to administer multiple doses to target every single stage of that life cycle. You have fish medicine, copper sulfate, aquarium sulfurics. There's all sorts of things. Really, if you're on a fish farm, it's better to just check with a veterinarian, because once one of your fish is infected, all of them are. So you'll want an antibiotic. Not an antibiotic, because that's for bacteria. You're not going to want that. Ignore that. But fish farming, fish infected with ick, fish die, hurts commercial fishing, hurts ecosystems, food chain. Yeah. The reason I mentioned antibiotic here is because once you have ick, you're more likely to have bacterial infections on top of that. So you still do want antibiotics, just it's not going to treat ick. You're going to need other things for that, because it's not a bacteria, it's a protist. So how do you prevent ick? 1, do not release pet fish into waterways. A lot of people think their fish is sick, or not sick, but already dead, or they're just like, well, it's hopeless, let's just release it and hope it gets better. No, you're gonna put it in the waterway, and it's gonna make other fish sick, and then it's gonna be a vicious cycle in a new place. So let's not do that. Treat new fish before you introduce them to an already established aquarium or pond. You don't know what parasites or protists that it may be carrying when you get a new fish. It's always good to treat them unless you absolutely trust wherever you bought them from. But if you don't know where they've come from, their history, you definitely need to treat them, and it never hurts to do it, even if you do know. 3, take care of your fish so they are not susceptible to this disease. Ick is already likely in your aquarium, but healthy fish will have an immune system that can fight it. So just make sure your fish stay healthy in general. And this is what ick looks like under a microscope. Other protists, we have dinoflagellates. They're a marine protist. They're unicellular alveolates, saccharomembranes, component of ocean plankton. Some are photosynthetic, some are heterotrophic, and they reproduce asexual fission. So negative impacts. Dinoflagellates create red tide when there are too many nutrients in the water. And when there are too many nutrients in the water, they release this toxin that's harmful to fish and humans, and this makes the water not safe to swim in. And because they're photosynthetic, they can reproduce or take the sunlight and grow really fast through asexual mitosis, and that grows really fast. What's the positive environmental impact? Dinoflagellates form symbiotic relationships with marine corals. So the dinoflagellates give food because they are photosynthetic in the form of energy to the coral polyps, which are animals and need energy to survive. And in turn, the coral polyps emit this waste that the dinoflagellates can eat. You can see it actually kind of in the photo, little brown stuff. That's why it looks so brown. And why is coral itself important? Well, why do we even need it? Well, coral protects our coastlines from storms, provides a safe home, hiding for aquatic life and food. Coral's used in medicine. Our coral reefs are very important, and most people take that for granted. But with global warming increasing the temperature of the water, this kills our dinoflagellates. And if our dinoflagellates aren't present to provide that energy needed for coral polyps to grow, they die. And this is a huge component of coral bleaching. So these are my sources, and that wraps up this way too long presentation. As you can see, I am obsessed with fish, and that is the end of it. Thank you for listening to me talk forever.